start, and I'm going to edit the recording to start here. So, okay. Thanks for joining. This is the Fall 22 Student Organization Advisor Workshop. I'm Dustin Lewis, and I'll be one of the facilitators. I use he, him, and I'm the Senior Associate Director for Student Involvement here.
And I'm Jill Finch. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the Coordinator in Student Involvement.
Okay, and our office is located on the second floor of Gallagher. If you're ever looking for us, this is our team, and I like to show off and point out just a couple individuals that are fresher or newer to the team. Sophie Stewart in the middle just rejoined Xavier, coming to us from Mount St. Joe, and Sophie now will be running the Manresa Orientation Program. So if any of you are faculty members that do any of the presentation or meetings with students during Manresa, Sophie will be the person that will liaison with the faculty for that. And then Ryan Spolar, I also like to point out, is the director for Gallagher Student Center. And Ryan helps to manage the facility that a lot of our organizations use for meeting and event space. Okay, so just to kick off, there's a few high-level advisor expectations. These might seem a little bit random, but I think it's helpful just to sort of think through a couple high-level things that we're then going to dive into a little deeper as we go. One of the biggest pieces is that we want advisors to be engaged, be responsive, developmental, and available to students. We're looking for advisors to help actively advise the group, but not micromanage and not also just be a clicker where basically you are the person that approves things, but you're really not engaging with the group. It's a fine line when it comes to oversight, but at the end of the day, you're part of what makes the organization accountable and responsible to the university. And the decisions they make as an organization can reflect on the institution. I like to point out, I've worked at other institutions before where students were not permitted to have a faculty staff advisor because the university did not want that direct of a relationship with the activities and the things that the organizations did. At Xavier, it's exactly opposite. We want there to be a connected relationship, and we want our student groups to see some level of accountability to the university itself. So advisors should never spend or access funds or commit to funds without the approval from the officers. Advisors can sign some contract agreements, but students cannot. And we'll talk more about that in a few minutes, part of your role also involves accountability for the officers and for the organization, and Jill and I are happy to help with that piece. One thing that I think is helpful when you start your relationship this year with them is to set some really clear expectations with the officers about what is your availability, your preferred mechanism for communication, hours of availability and responsiveness, things like that. We'll talk a lot more about travel in a bit, but just know that chaperoning might be part of the travel piece, but it doesn't have to be you. Students can, if they need to take a chaperone, and I'll explain in a bit, they can identify any faculty or staff member who might be available and willing. And when it comes to traveling with students, we would encourage you to not drive with students in your own vehicle because of the liability that you take on personally. We also would encourage, and some of this is just practical, not being alone with a student for an extended period of time, and certainly not sharing alone a room with a student one-on-one when traveling. And then finally, ask questions and ask for help. So again, I know I covered a bunch of different pieces here, but this is how we'll start off. Jill is going to be monitoring the chat throughout this because I'm sharing my screen and we're recording this to be able to put it up online later for other employees that missed the training. But feel free to unmute, interrupt, or throw something in the chat and we can stop as we go and answer questions. So that being said, we are going to move on. We start off with finances and just sort of doing a broad overview of how the world of student organization finances work, how you can spend and access funds, how the students will be submitting things and routing them through you. But we'll spend a little bit of time in the finances and explaining some new things and also answering questions.
So we're going to start with funds and accounts. Every organization has their own specific fund number and it is unique to your organization. In order to find this, if they go into EngageXU to their group page under settings, you can find the student org fund number. And this number is needed for any financial form that's going to be submitted in Engage, and it's needed for depositing any funds in the Bursar's office. And then another feature all of the student orgs have is their accounting book. And you can access this when you go into the group page. Only officers, and by officers, we mean your president, your treasurer, vice president, and you as an advisor have access to the accounting book. And one nice feature this does have, it has an archive feature, so you can view previous years to see what your organization has spent.
So one of the changes this year is the student payment advance form. The student payment advance is replacing what used to be the cash advance form. And one of the biggest reasons is that the university is now moving toward going cashless. So across campus, you'll find a lot of the retail and point of sale spaces no longer take cash, they only take card. And so we were notified this summer that the university is eliminating cash advances. What those were previously used for was one mechanism for people, students, to be able to pay for items or to make purchases for their organization to add up expenses. And what they could do is request cash from the bursar's office and then be able to go spend it and return any unspent cash and receipts back to the bursar. So we know that eliminating cash also creates some disadvantages and disproportionately affects some of our students over others, namely being that some of our students don't have access to credit cards or to funds in their checking account that they can use to spend toward their club and wait for a reimbursement. And so we worked out with the university to offer Focus Blue cards, which is an advance form of payment. What your students can do is that they can fill out a payment advance form and request up to a few $100 and then get a Focus Blue card that's issued to them. This is not a P card, but it is branded as a plastic card that has like a Visa emblem on it. The card can be preloaded with some cash, and the students then can go make purchases for a specific event or can take it with them when they travel, and all of the receipts and the card itself then gets returned back to the university. The card exchange goes through the controller's office, and that's one of the pieces I point out that a lot of students and even a lot of employees don't know where that office is located. The controller's office is in Schmidt Hall, which for a lot of you, probably being in the provost area, you would know that is around the corner from the first floor, which now is legal counsel and previously was the provost office. Advances are only issued for fully approved events, so students have to submit their event or their trip through EngageXU first and get it approved before we'll clear them to get a card. The student listed on the advance is the person responsible for the advance itself. So we know a practice that's pretty common is that you might have an older student or like a senior who's doing clinicals or student teaching and is less likely to be physically on campus, might text another student who might be younger or has more availability to say, hey, we need to go buy some stuff. Can you put in a request for one of those cards? The student is being helpful, puts in a request, and then the card itself can get handed off to another person. Well, the way this works is whoever takes out the Focus Blue card is the person responsible for the advance. So if the card goes missing or if the receipts are not returned, the student who took out the advance is the one whose bursar bill would be billed the difference. The Focus Blue card can be used to purchase goods, so a lot of point of sale spots, things like Walmart, Target, Kroger, also can be used to purchase like food at somewhere like Condado, or if the students go to another restaurant like Raising Cane's to purchase food for a meeting. It also can be used for online sales. So like if they want to order food online or get it delivered, they want to purchase some goods through an online retailer. The big thing on the Focus Blue cards is that you can't use it to pay a performer or an individual for service. So you can't use it to like rent a facility or rent equipment like inflatables, things like that. The organization is responsible for tracking and maintaining all of those receipts, and missing receipts will not be accepted. So one of the pro tips that we offer you as an advisor who sometimes might take on a receipt or a personal expense to get reimbursed, and we certainly tell students this, is the moment there's a receipt involved, you should pull out your phone and take a photo of it. There's a really good chance that you're not going to lose your phone, but there's a good chance you will lose just a small paper receipt. Any questions about the student payment advance? I'll pause and see if anybody wants to ask or unmute. Okay. Like I said, this is a change from practice in previous years. We no longer do cash advances, but students will find that this is really helpful and that it's taken at most places. The Focus Blue Card does take a couple days for it to be issued. And again, they're issuing it for sort of a one-time use. So they're checking it out and borrowing it, using it to do whatever it is they need to do, and then returning the card, and it'll be zero funded at that point, and then probably released out to another student at that time.
So another form we have is the pre-spend authorization form. And this is if students wish to spend more than $300 of their own personal money. And in order for them to be reimbursed, they have to have this form approved. The reason we have this form is so we can perhaps intervene. There's a good chance that if they're trying to spend more than $300, Dustin and I can step in and say, no, you can use the purchase form, or they can use one of our purchasing cards we have, or if any of you as advisors have purchasing cards. It's just so they don't end up spending a ton of their own personal money. And then another form we have is the student reimbursement form. All students are reimbursed through Zelle for purchases, and this is for any purchases up to $300. We can reimburse for over $300 if they have the pre-spend authorization form approved. They have to upload itemized copies of their receipts. Missing receipts will not be reimbursed. And like Dustin said, the best thing for them to do is take photos. And since the university is tax exempted, we don't reimburse them for sales tax.
So the advisors, oh, go ahead.
Oh, sorry, no, you're good.
The advisors are also reimbursed by Zelle, and this is for purchases that were approved by student org officers. So again, we want to make sure that if the advisor is going to take on a purchase or commit to dollars, that the student club has authorized it and is aware of that. You also have to upload itemized copies of receipts to get reimbursed. Missing receipts won't be reimbursed. The university is tax exempted. One thing that's different about this form is that when the advisor submits a reimbursement, the student org president or treasurer must be the ones that approve your reimbursement. And that's just to say that the officers know that you've spent money on behalf of the club. Advisors are also reimbursed through Zelle, and it's very quick. Many of you really, really appreciate and enjoy this because you don't have to wait for the university to set you up with direct deposit or issue a check through Xavier Buy. And so again, Jill can put in a Zelle reimbursement today, and tomorrow morning you would wake up with cash in your checking account. The one thing to note on this in particular is that most of you probably use Zelle in your personal life or have it connected with personal checking if you've used it before. So more likely than not, your Zelle account is going to get connected to your personal email or your cell phone number and not connected to your Xavier email unless you set it up that way. I see we have a question. What do we get, Jill?
From Robin. She said she's never used Zelle. Does she need to make an account? Yes. Sorry, Dustin.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
On the form, if you go into the advisor reimbursement form at the beginning, if you select no, it actually gives you detailed instructions on how to set up an account.
And Zelle is connected to about 95% of checking accounts across the country. Really, the very few that it doesn't connect to are a handful of credit unions, but for the most part, nearly every student and advisor we've ever tried to reimburse was successfully connected by Zelle. And in the event that they're not, we will issue that through Xavier Buy, and you'll either get a paper check cut to you or it'll get direct deposited.
And then another form we have is the purchase form. And we have students use this so they can order items from Amazon or office supplies from Brown Enterprise Solutions. We also use this to pay vendors. So with this, they just have to get a quote and submit that into this form. I enter into Xavier Buy. When the items are received here, they normally come to our office. I'll let the students know your items are here. We also don't use this to hire any students. If your organization would need to hire a student as a graphic designer or a DJ, we just ask that they stop by and see Dustin to set all of that up. One other thing we've been telling students just to know, they think with ordering from Amazon through the purchase form, it's going to be super quick. They get it the next day. After I approve and place the order, it has to go through another level of approval in Xavier Buy. So we've been telling them to give it 2 to 3 days at least.
So the quick recap when it comes to everything in the world of payments, the purchase form is really the student portal to be able to do things connected to Xavier Buy. If any of you have any experience or you've worked with an admin or anyone in your department or office before, you would know Xavier Buy is really complex, and that's the procurement and purchasing system the university uses. We don't want students in the system, so they use this purchase form to interact with Jill and say, here's a contract I got from a vendor, here's a quote we got for purchasing apparel, or can you put in an order for Amazon for me or order office supplies for me? Whatever it might be, Jill basically synthesizes what's in the purchase form into a requisition and purchase order in Xavier Buy. So that's one way, especially for some bigger ticket items, that we can pay for them that doesn't require reimbursement. But we do know that sometimes students and advisors will spend some of your own funds. And so we then have the process to be able to set up through Zelle and reimburse someone and do it relatively quickly. If a student is trying to spend more than $300, we want that pre-spend authorization form, because a lot of times Jill and I will intervene and say, hey, before you put all this money on a card and then have an upset parent or you're impatiently waiting to get reimbursed, let's see if we can put it on a university credit card or find another route to be able to make the payment. And then again, a payment advance form, especially for something that's a little bit lower level, it's just up to a few $100, but a student can get access to some funding to help go spend and make purchases for the organization. So those are all the different methods in which a student is going to access funds. Are there any questions with how any of that works?
Okay, so I do have a question now. So I was looking over here to double check some of our totals. This might be specific to my group, but I know the over under 300 is the limit, but for Sweat, they are paying for services. It's not a performer, but they're paying to take someone to a fitness class. So I'm now a little confused when we can or how we can do this, because it sounds like with the new Focus Blue card, they probably couldn't be using that for that type of a program. But right now, especially with our membership boost, we are right at the 300 mark probably for the rest of the year for just about everything that they're doing.
So they can use it at point of sale purchases. So like if you go to a yoga studio and there's a register and point of sale, or like a Square, they can use it there.
Okay.
They can't use it to hire an individual. So if they're going to hire their own instructor, they can't use the Focus Blue card, because it's not like a gift card you can just hand to someone and say, well, here's your payment, there's $300 on here, thanks.
But as long as there's like a point of sale, like a register or something there, then they could still be using the Focus Blue card.
Yeah, a point of sale exchange when it's a business.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you for clarifying.
No problem. Any other questions on payments while we're here? The screen I stopped at is this just shows you the visual of workflow approval so that you can sort of visualize all the forms in this world. Really start with a student initiates the form. It then comes to you as the advisor for approval. Then it moves to us, which primarily is me verifying and authorizing. And then it moves on to whoever's going to execute the payment. So in the world of Zelle, that goes to Jill. With a lot of the procurement and purchasing pieces, that goes to Jill. If it's going to be issuing a Focus Blue card, that'll be at the controller's office, etc. So next up, when it comes to the student activity fee, which is really what powers probably all of your organizations, it's the SGA funding that they receive. That activity fee can't be donated, which includes dispersing it as a scholarship or a payment to a charitable group. Groups that are interested in donating, they need to fundraise those dollars. So I use the example of the activity fee is meant to create opportunities, activities, events on campus to add to campus life. It's not meant to be issued as a payment and a donation to a charity, but there are ways in which some of our organizations will use that funding to host an event that is a fundraiser for charity. So like you see in the photo here, we've got Relay for Life being hosted by Colleges Against Cancer. They take the activity fee funding from SGA and they use it to buy food, hire a DJ, to rent some inflatables and equipment, and they host their Relay for Life event in which they accept donations and pledges and all kinds of things from participants and from their friends and family. And all of the donations they receive becomes the donation that they issue to the American Cancer Society. Treasurers or fundraising chairs really are responsible for tracking these dollars separately and paying attention to what amount is in the group's balance that's eligible to donate versus what amount is the activity fee. At the end of the day, when you go back to that accounting book that Jill and I showed you, it really just looks and operates like a checkbook in terms of money goes in, money comes out, but you can't really earmark and note we're saving this for this particular reason. And so we tell your student groups that they really need to monitor that and pay attention to it and sort of track it on their own. So they're aware of what money they actually have to spend and what money that they've raised for a particular reason. Scholarships, exactly the same. The money from the activity fee was not put in and created so that we could create a scholarship for one or two individuals. They have to fundraise those dollars. March Gladness, just as a plug here, is a great time each spring that they can do a focused campaign with fundraising. Obviously, we get a lot of attention from employees, but also from students, parents, friends, family, alumni, donors. So March Gladness can be a great time for a group to really drive in some of their fundraising efforts.
So next we'll talk about contract signature authority. We've told the students they cannot sign contracts on behalf of the university. For some certain circumstances, you as advisors can, like for catering or space rentals. And then any type of equipment rental that your group might need to do, they have to get a certificate of insurance on file with risk management prior to signing. And then if they are trying to bring any performers or speakers, they either have to sign a performance agreement or an independent contractor form with the university. And depending on the cost of the performer or speaker, there's just different tiers of signatures. So we've just been telling the students if they're going to do any of this, just make sure to do it well in advance and reach out to our office for help. And then next, we're going to cover events and activities. So submitting events in EngageXU, we require that groups submit all of their meetings and events through Engage. Once they submit an event, then a supplemental form will populate, and that's the event and space registration form. We've been telling them one thing to note: after they create their event, if they have to go in and change any type of date, time, location, when they do this, it will reset the workflow approval. So you might approve something, then they go in and change something in the event. It's going to come right back to you for approval. So just something to note.
So part of the event piece is it helps us to better understand our retention model and some of our data tracking. And so we require that students do take attendance at their different events and that they load that attendance into Engage. It helps us see how active they are. It helps us to know how we should better direct resources in the future. But it also is a piece where we can feed this into retention data to determine what students are getting connected where and what students are we missing, what kinds of programs and services are not reaching certain types of students. They can track attendance a bunch of different ways, and technically anyone who's an officer, which would include the advisor, officers being just the person who has administrative control for a group page, can track attendance with an event in there. There's ways that they can scan QR codes on phones, or you can use a laptop or a computer to check people in, etc. But there's a how-to guide on taking attendance that's on our website. Any questions so far?
Great, so space reservations. We just want to highlight some of the main spaces that students do use, and they have to reserve some of them through the form, and in the form we also direct them on how to reserve spaces. For example, like the classrooms, Gallagher, you use Mazevo. The hub, you reach out to Rec Sports and Cintas Center staff. With the outdoor areas like Xavier Yard, North and South Yard, Upper Yard above the CAF, and the Academic Mall, those spaces are reserved through our office, so I'll send a confirmation email, and same with Justice Atrium right outside of the CAF.
So when it comes to food trucks, just a quick note here. So we have really an exclusive contract with Chartwells that covers food service on our campus, with the exception of Credo. And so when it comes to food trucks, those essentially become mobile billboards for other businesses. Legally and contractually, we really don't have the right to have food trucks, but for the most part, as long as there's not too many trucks and too often, Chartwells tends to say they get it. Variety's the spice of life. Our students get excited when they can have some other different foods on campus. So our office helps to coordinate this. A lot of times the food trucks get parked out in the circle. And once we get through the first couple of weeks of school, it tends to slow down a little bit, but we try to have it regulated to like a food truck or so once every month or two a month kind of thing. Mostly just know that food trucks are not permitted to sell food on campus. And so a lot of student groups are detoured from working with the food truck because they have to pre-arrange for quantities and payment in most cases. If the group wants to bring a food truck, though, they're welcome to work with us, and we can help talk through what type of certification they need to provide from the health department and what food trucks we work through frequently.
So all fundraising must be registered through the event and space registration form. And this could include anything like sales to members, so t-shirt sales, sales to individuals outside of the club, letter writing campaign, dues collection, working an event, so they could work concessions at a basketball game or a Reds game or Bengals game, and then collecting donated items for charity. Student groups are prohibited from selling homemade baked goods. And when they are fundraising for charitable purposes, they just need to carefully track any funds they've raised, so that way they send the correct donation amount to the charity. And if your club is interested in collecting dues, they can reach out to Dustin. It's very easy to do through Engage.
Any questions about fundraising? So campus public speakers, it's a policy that exists. And when it comes to hosting a speaker, whether it's a big speaker or whether it's someone who's just talking at an event or a club meeting, when they're filling out the event form in Engage ICU, they should indicate that there's a speaker or a guest lecturer. There'll be questions like, who is it? What's their sort of qualification? And what are they generally talking about? Controversial events are not denied on the basis of controversy, but they do help us to understand how the university may best prepare a response. One of the examples I use is last year, there was an academic program that was connected with bringing a more controversial speaker to campus. There were several students, faculty, staff that were upset about the speaker. However, it was never canceled. The university held the event because we don't cancel events just for the sake of controversy. One thing I do point out here is that when it comes to academic freedom, that does not inherently apply to student organization events. A club can collaborate with a professor or academic department, but it's beyond the bounds of the classroom and the learning experience. And because it becomes co-curricular, it gets to be a very gray area as to how much academic freedom protects the action and the activity within the club. Any questions about this? Sorry, also, there's an event outside if it's picking up any audio or music. I'm sure Jill's hearing it as well.
I do have a question about
Yeah.
that. So if we did have a speaker come or a musician or something that is not charging money, like to a Spanish club meeting, for example, do the student leaders still need to fill out a form that we're having a speaker come?
They do. It more so is so the university is know who is being invited onto our campus and what are they doing here. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
And that good question, Robin, and that is whether it's virtual or in person, either way.
Okay. Thank you.
No problem.
So next we'll cover political activities. So due to the university's designation within the IRS, the university is limited in its ability to participate in political campaigns. Student orgs do have the opportunity to participate in certain kinds of lobbying, like voter registration, and the university can't be seen as endorsing any political candidate or party. So we've been telling students, your specific club can endorse a specific candidate or party, but you just can't go out into the yard and post signs to make it seem like Xavier is supporting that person or party. And then once again, we always ask that they submit this through the event and space registration form.
Alcohol can be permitted with permission at student events, but the students have to do some heavy lift to sort of prove that alcohol is not the focal point of the event, that it's, you know, something that's supplementary. So things like you could tour Rheingeist and you could sample the product, or you could have like a banquet or a gala where there just happens to be beer and wine being served. But the majority of the attendees being 21 being part of the rule, that is a heavy lift for a lot of groups. So we tend to not see many student alcohol events until later in the spring when there tends to be a higher population on campus who are of age. This is also a part of the event form. So if they're interested in having alcohol submitted, they'll need to check the box on the event form and answer some additional questions.
So with motion picture copyright, the copyright law prohibits a student org from screening a feature film or documentary without a license. So there are educational exemptions. They're limited to when an instructor uses the film as part of their regularly scheduled course and when attendance is limited to students enrolled in that course. Clubs can't bypass the licensing by partnering with the class or by having a professor as a faculty advisor for their group. Permitted streaming services, though, they can use Netflix original documentaries, Canopy through the university library, and Spectrum U, which they can all log into with their Xavier credentials.
Any questions about motion picture? Okay.
So with brand use, if any club needs to order any type of apparel or promotional items, they need to submit a form called the Promotional Materials and Apparel Approval Form in Engage, and that'll go to Marketing and Communications for approval. And then students are limited to using either the primary university brand or the secondary. D'Artagnan and Blue Blob are limited to athletic use only. And we also limit the vendors that can be used to those that are licensed with the university. This website is very helpful for students to look at. It also explains just how to go about ordering apparel. And the list of vendors is on this website. There are some great local vendors.
Yep. So if you're ever ordering any sort of t-shirts or apparel for the club, or if they're doing any kind of giveaway that's going to be screen printed and have the club name on it or something like that, just know you should always start with xavier.edu/apparel, and that's going to walk you through step by step how this works. So travel is one of the things that has changed the most this year, but also has reverted to some practices we were doing back in 2019 and before. The big piece on student domestic travel is that we refer to travel or trips as going more than 35 miles from campus, so further than like Miami University or outside of the greater Cincinnati area, or involving an overnight stay, so spending the night away from Xavier regardless of distance, even if it's like at Milford. If it's overnight, that's considered travel. So students should submit a student domestic travel itinerary form in EngageXU at least 3 weeks prior to travel. And when submitting the form, they're going to be asked to submit a list of participants. And there's a template that we accept that list in because we need to have like a list of emergency contacts, etc. It can be a partial list when they first submit, but the final updated list needs to be filed at least 48 hours before they travel. We know that when it comes to travel, it becomes a bigger thing for students in terms of time away and figuring out their priorities and if they want to travel and if there's cost with that. So we know that some students really won't commit until the last minute, but the university wants to know who is traveling so that in case of emergency, let's say that you're traveling with a group to Chicago and there's some sort of a car accident, we then can immediately know what students are a part of this trip and who needs to be accounted for. Same thing if there's some sort of a mass incident here on campus, we know what students were not at campus are not to be accounted for in the residence halls or in like classrooms and things like that. So part of your travel form also always gets submitted to Xavier Police so that they can track and know who is officially traveling and away from campus. Your travel form also requires some detailed travel information about hotels, flights, how are you traveling, when are you departing and arriving. We tell student orgs that purchases associated with the trip are only going to be approved for reimbursement or payment after the travel form has been submitted and approved. So that's where some of your groups will be motivated to submit this form very early because they're trying to coordinate really complex travel and they don't want to wait till the last minute to try to book flights and reserve a coach bus and things like that. Once again, when it comes to travel, some trips require a chaperone and some do not. There's a form on our website called the Travel Risk Matrix that basically walks through a series of questions. If the answer is yes to any of those questions, then yes, the trip requires a chaperone. So it's things like, are any of the participants going to be underage, under 18? Are you going to be mixing participants that are Xavier students with non-Xavier students? So like sometimes we have a group from Xavier that might share a bus with UC to a march or a conference. So that would require a chaperone. If there's going to be more than 12 students, 12 sort of becomes the threshold of if there's more than 12 traveling, there should also be an employee that goes with them. And then the level of risk. So if they're doing something that's high risk in terms of just physical risk, we want to send an employee with them. And then the biggest piece on travel too is what they're doing. Is it a highly structured trip or not? So highly structured might be students are attending a conference where there's a really clear sort of conference schedule and it walks through, here's what we're going to be doing every day and every hour, versus you're taking a group of students to Chicago and they have like a couple of things they want to sightsee, but there's a lot of just self-exploration and sort of free time involved with the trip. Or there's some things that they're going to do where they're just winging it and they're just going to say, oh, we feel like doing this today. In those instances where there's less structure, we want a chaperone to go. So if you're sending students to like a conference and there's less than 12 and no one's underage, there's a really good chance that we are not requiring a faculty or staff to go with them. The only thing that's a holdover from COVID era, as we sort of see this move into hopefully what is now an endemic stage, is that trip organizers should tell students if they're not feeling well or if they're presenting symptoms of COVID, they should test and not travel. And then if a student develops any symptoms of COVID while traveling, they should test and isolate away from the group. The big piece of this, the official university response being, if a student knowingly develops COVID while traveling, they are to be isolated and left. And so they should know that before they go. While some trips might be just a single overnight, and that might not be the case, if you're going to be taking students for 5, 6, 7 days and someone gets sick while gone, they are supposed to isolate in a separate space and then not return with the rest of the group. They're not supposed to get back into a car or on a plane or share a bus because we're knowingly exposing other students and employees to COVID if they test and find out that they're positive for COVID. So I'll pause for a second because I know there are a bunch of different changes with travel just to see if there's any questions that pop up. This rock band is really rocking out on the yard. So if you can't hear this through my microphone, I'm surprised, but. So the travel piece is different than just an off-campus activity. An off-campus activity is we're staying in the city, we're not gone overnight, we're going to go skiing at Perfect North, we're going to go do a service project at Free Store Food Bank, we're going on a retreat in the city, and we're going to a Reds game or Bengals game or something like that. Those are just off-campus activities, so students just need to submit a normal event in EngageXU, indicate they're going off campus, and then that event will route for approval like everything else does. But again, it's not the travel form. They don't need to upload the attachment of who's going. We would encourage them to still take attendance in the event so that we know who traveled or who was on this off-campus activity. The only additional forms that may need to be completed for an off-campus activity are just if the activity is high risk. And I use the example that out of the 12 years I've been working here that I've taken students on a ski trip, probably 8 of those years I've had to go to the emergency room with somebody. And so I always tell students if the activity is high risk, we need them to sign a liability waiver for the university before they go. Any questions at all about travel and off campus? Okay.
So we have a new anti-hazing policy effective this summer. Ohio passed Collins Law, which requires all students and advisors to go through a hazing awareness and prevention training. Students received a link on August 16th, and our links for as employees should be going out anytime And with this training, all students and employees have to complete it. And per the law, students have to complete the training in order to participate in any sort of group or organization affiliated with Xavier. There's also mandated reporting. So if you have knowledge or witness any type of hazing, you have to report it to Xavier and to XUPD.
Yep. So the Dean of Students area will be coordinating the student efforts. And I had a meeting about this earlier this afternoon. Out of the 5,900 registered students, which includes grad students in Apex and ABSN, we've already had 1,800 complete the training, about 900 of that being first years because this was included as part of the Road to Xavier, and then about 900 of it probably being a number of students that you already work with. We're going to be pushing out some more messaging just to tell them, especially around student org officers and members and advisors, we really need everyone to go in and take the training. HR will be coordinating the employee requirement piece. And so all of us will get our links and they'll basically say every employee needs to take, the 25, 30 minutes to go through the hazing training. And you do it once and you're done. It'll be continued to be a part of the Road to Xavier for entering classes. So we know that it's going to be messy this first year or two as we sort of try to get as many students as we can into this. But we know that over the next few years, at least all of our undergrads will have worked through this as they're taking it as part of their entrance into Xavier. The other piece on hazing is that a lot of times we think of hazing as more extreme actions required of members. So there's a lot of it that gets associated with like alcohol behavior, but that's not how hazing always presents itself. Sometimes it begins really simple and nebulous and grows into something worse that isn't good and positive for people that are aspiring to join a group. So building in extra requirements and saying unnecessary duties are being assigned to new members or first year members that other people don't have to participate or comply with. Could be things like requiring them to greet older members in a specific way, requiring people to carry things around campus and show them if they're asked by a member to say, you have your binder with you, you have your book, you need to have it with you at all times. Wearing embarrassing or uncomfortable clothing and forced consumption is also a part of it. So we tell students a lot, if you say to yourself, why do I have to do this? I don't understand, just to join. Or if the answer that you get is because everyone before you did it, there might be a pattern of hazing and they should report it. Any questions about the anti-hazing and hazing prevention? Like Jill said, it is passed into law in the state of Ohio called Collins Law, and all of us will have to comply.
So we have a couple more policies our office oversees, and one of those is the end of campus programming. The cutoff each semester for student events is on the Friday before finals week at midnight. As soon as finals over, campus events can resume. And then with gambling, in short, money cannot be exchanged for betting, split the pot, or cash prizes, and students cannot receive cash as a prize.
So for organizations, other than honors societies, which I don't think any of you are advising, let me just take another peek at who's in here. Yeah, I think this applies for all of your groups. So baseline is a requirement that we started a few years back, and we suspended it when COVID first began because it was really complicated. The epitome of why baseline is that over the course of a number of years, we saw a significant decline in the activity with our student organizations to the detriment of the student body. We saw that there were a lot of first-year students who were arriving on campus that were seeking ways to build community and connect with one another. And we were getting the same narrative dozens of times every year of, I saw on OrgSync and now EngageXU all these groups, and I went through and joined them. I never heard from anyone. No one ever messaged me. No one ever followed up with me, and I never heard back from anybody. Then they reached out to the president or the advisor of the group. They didn't hear anything from them. Then we had club day like we did last week, and students would go sign up at tables and give their email. They would never hear anything back from anybody. And so finally we get to a point where students were saying that there were at least a number of different organizations that were not meeting regularly, were not holding events, and that basically students were saying, oh, I'm really overwhelmed and busy, and they just weren't active. And we said, we understand that, but that speaks more to whether or not you have the capacity to run this club than it does whether or not the club should exist. So Baseline was created to say, if you want to be an active and recognized organization and you want to get funding and you want the university to let you reserve space, you've got to meet these minimum requirements. So the minimum baseline being that we want them to hold a meeting once a month, which is not a very heavy lift. And some of your organizations meet more frequently than that. Like Sweat meets more regularly. I think they meet every week, or they hold events almost every week. So clubs being required to hold at least one meeting a month, which comes out to about 3 times in the fall, 4 times in the spring. They then have to submit documentation that the meeting happened through EngageXU. Faculty staff engagement, so we want that they're meeting as officers with you as their advisor at least once a month. To my knowledge, I think most of you who've been working with organizations, you have that sort of relationship. What I've told students is we're not defining what that meeting looks like, but the hope is that they don't just catch you if you're a faculty after class and say, hey, just wanted to let you know everything's going okay. And you're like, okay, sounds good. We want that to be that it's a conversation, that it's either on the phone or Zoom or in person. It's during office hours, where basically the group can say, hey, here's the stuff that we're talking about doing, or we have some questions, or we want to get your advice. We want the advisor, again, to be engaged in the group. They also will be submitting a really simple recruitment and retention plan, just indicating, hey, here are the things we're doing to actively recruit this fall and to then retain the people that we recruit. That can just be a series of bullet points reported. Then each semester, clubs are required to have at least 2 events outside of a regular meeting. So for many of you, your organization well exceeds past this. Like Sweat, for example, does all sorts of events regularly where they're going to different studios and they're practicing exercise and doing different types of athleticism. So they are meeting and exceeding that requirement. We will allow fundraisers to be a part of this. We're pretty broad with what this is. We just want that the club is active and that members of the university community see them and can engage with them. Then there's a service requirement because we're Jesuit Catholic. We think service matters. And so we want every organization to find a way to do service in a way that makes sense and is meaningful for them. So 1 service activity per year, with the goal that you get the majority of your roster to participate. The lowest hanging fruit will be that there's events like Community Action Day, where everyone at Xavier is welcome and invited, that they can participate. The next one being October 1st. But hopefully your group, if they don't already do service, can find a way that makes sense and is meaningful to them. So it could be that they're doing something that's mentoring with the younger people, with kids, teenagers. It could be that they are out doing some physical cleanup or some service in the community. Just finding ways that they can engage and give back to the world around them. And then the final piece being, we want them to spend their money. We want every organization to spend at least 85% of the funds that they were given at part of the activity fee, mostly because that funding was created and raised out of the current students that are here, which includes seniors. So we want to make sure that they also get their money's worth. I'll pause and see if there's any questions about Baseline, but you should know this program was not created just because this will be fun to track more information and to send emails to people saying, hey, why aren't you active? This was created in reaction to the fact that for a number of years, our student organizations became less and less active and started to be more and more harmful to the community we're trying to create and the engagement we're trying to do to retain students. So, any questions on Baseline? I don't know what group is playing outside right now. Hopefully none of your organizations, but all they've been playing is 70s and 80s hits. And all I keep thinking is, students know this and like this? It's very interesting. Anyway, okay, that's it for our training. So do we have any questions